Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of composure. But on a Tuesday night in 1984, a single sob from the third row forced him to walk away from a $50 million contract. By the end of this story, you will understand the 12 whispered words that shattered the most famous man in America and changed television history forever. They say that in the golden age of television, the lights of Studio One in Burbank were so bright they could hide 1,000 secrets, but they could never hide the truth of a man's heart. For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the steady heartbeat of America, a man whose effortless charm made us feel like we were never truly alone. But one Tuesday night, the most polished professional in broadcasting encountered something he wasn't prepared for, a sound that didn't belong in a comedy routine. The evening had started with the usual electricity. Johnny stepped through the multicolored curtains, adjusted his tie with that classic boyish grin, and began a monologue that was hitting every mark. He was on fire, leaning into the microphone with the mischief of a man who held the world in the palm of his hand. But just as he reached the punchline of his third joke, a sound pierced through the laughter like a cold wind through a summer house. It wasn't a cheer, and it wasn't a heckle. It was a sob, deep, ragged, and filled with a kind of prehistoric grief that makes your own blood run cold. Johnny stopped. He didn't just pause for timing. He froze, his hands hovering as if trying to catch a falling glass. The band trailed off into an awkward silence, leaving only the hum of the studio lights. In the third row, a woman sat, bowed over, her face buried in weathered hands as she sobbed with a weight too heavy for her frail frame to carry. 20 million people watched as the king of late night looked genuinely afraid, his composure shattering as a stranger's tears tore the night's script to pieces. The producers were frantic in the wings, waving their arms and pointing to the commercial break cards, desperate to cut away. They wanted to protect the brand, to keep the show light and breezy, and to usher the grieving woman out into the hallway where the cameras couldn't see her. But Johnny didn't look at the wings, and he didn't look at the cue cards. He stayed fixed on that woman in the third row, his eyes softening into a look of recognition that sent a shiver through everyone watching. He took a slow, deliberate step off the stage, descending the stairs into the audience, a move that was strictly forbidden by the brass at the network. As he approached her, the silence in the room became so heavy you could hear the hum of the overhead lights and the faint smell of the stage wax beneath his feet. He knelt down in the narrow aisle, the expensive fabric of his suit pressing against the floor, and he gently placed a hand on the woman's trembling arm. In the dim glow of the studio audience, the man who had seen everything suddenly realized he was looking at the only person who had ever truly seen him. The audience watched in a trance as the king of television reached out, his hand trembling just a fraction, as he prepared to confront a ghost from a life he thought he had left behind in the dust of the Great Plains. Before we reveal the identity of this mysterious woman, tell us in the comments, is there a teacher or mentor from your past whose voice still guides you today? We'd love to hear your stories. The woman slowly lifted her head, and as her hands fell away from her eyes, the years seemed to peel back like the pages of a well-worn book. She was small, wrapped in a knitted shawl that had been mended a dozen times, and her eyes were a soft, faded blue that held a world of kindness. Johnny didn't speak at first. He simply stared while the silence in the room grew into a heavy, physical weight. Finally, he whispered a name that had never been spoken in that studio, a name that belonged to a quiet schoolhouse in Nebraska half a century ago. The woman reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face with unbearable tenderness. She spoke his name not as a celebrity, but as the shy little boy who once sat in the front row of her classroom trying to disappear into his desk. She was Mrs. Gable, the woman who taught him his letters and proved his voice mattered when the world told him to be silent. The audience sat in stunned silence as they realized this wasn't a random fan, but the architect of the man standing before them. The cameras stayed locked on them, capturing every tear that traced a path through the makeup on Johnny's face. He forgot about the ratings, the guests waiting behind the curtain, and the millions watching through a glass screen. For those few moments, he was back in a world of chalk dust and cornfields, standing before the only person who knew the truth about the lonely child behind the famous smile. Mrs. Gable leaned in closer, her voice cracking as she told him she had traveled over 1,000 miles just to see him one last time before her journey reached its final horizon. The air in the studio seemed to vanish as she pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from her pocket, something she had carried since 1934. It was a relic of a different time, a physical bridge between the superstar and the struggling boy he used to be. Johnny took the paper with hands that were now shaking uncontrollably, his eyes scanning the faded ink as if he were reading a holy text, unaware that this note contained a secret that would shatter his heart. To understand the man the world called the King of Late Night, you have to travel back to a time when the only lights he knew were the orange hues of a Nebraska sunset and the flickering glow of a kerosene lamp. Before the skyscrapers of New York, there was a quiet, stuttering boy who found it easier to talk to the wind than to his own classmates. This was the boy Mrs. Gable remembered. A child whose heart was as wide as the plains, but whose spirit was as fragile as a winter leaf. In those lean years of the 1930s, the world was a gray and dusty place where a young boy lived in the shadows of his own shyness. The air smelled of dry corn husks and the sweet scent of a wood fire. He had discovered a deck of cards, finding comfort in the way a simple trick made people look at him without seeing the fear in his eyes. While the other children laughed at his fumbling fingers, Mrs. Gable saw a storyteller waiting for his stage. Every Friday in that one-room schoolhouse, she would clear the front of the room to give the forgotten children a moment in the sun. She had a drawer filled with scraps of blue silk ribbon, leftover remnants from her own sewing basket. To the world, they were just rags, but to that little boy, they were the ultimate validation of his existence. He would stand up, knees knocking, to perform a card vanish while Mrs. Gable stood at the back and applauded until her palms were red. If this moment of childhood hope is resonating with you, please hit that like button. It helps this story of kindness reach the people who need to hear it most today. She would walk over to him, eye level, and pin one of those blue ribbons to his worn flannel shirt. She told him that he had a gift for making people forget their troubles, a gift that was more valuable than gold. She told him that one day, he would have a stage so large that the whole country would be his classroom. Those ribbons became his armor, the only thing that kept him going when the loneliness felt like it might swallow him whole. He kept them in a cigar box under his bed, counting them every night, promising himself that he would never let her down. But as Johnny stared at the frail woman in the third row, he realized those ribbons were the reason he had survived the journey at all, a secret debt of the soul that had gone unpaid. Mrs. Gable reached into her bag, pulling out an envelope that was so thin and translucent, it looked as though it were made of old lace. She didn't hand it to him immediately. She held it against her heart for a moment, her eyes closing as if she were drawing strength from the ink inside. When she finally offered it to him, Johnny took it with a reverence, usually reserved for the most sacred of relics. Inside was a letter, written in the frantic, looping scrawl of a 12-year-old boy, dated July 14th, 1937. It was a letter Johnny had forgotten he had ever sent. A desperate message from a summer when his family was moving away, and he felt as though his entire world was being dismantled. He began to read it aloud, his voice cracking and skipping like an old vinyl record as the words of his younger self echoed through the auditorium. The letter contained a solemn, childhood vow. He had written that if he ever became someone important, he would come back and find her so she would never have to be alone again. As Johnny read those words, the irony of his immense fame crashed down upon him. He had become the most important man in television, yet he had allowed the woman who planted the seeds of his soul to drift into the shadows of time. Mrs. Gable whispered that she hadn't come to collect on that promise. She had come because her doctors had told her that her time on this earth was approaching its quiet conclusion, and she couldn't pass into the next life without knowing that the little boy who loved magic had found his way home. The audience was no longer a crowd of strangers. They were a collective witness to a miracle of grace. People were weeping openly at the sight of this icon, realizing that his greatest achievement wasn't a television show, but the impact he had made on a single, humble teacher in the middle of a cornfield. Johnny realized that she had spent her life savings on a bus ticket and a dream, just to see his face before her world went dark. The weight of her pending departure hung in the air, a heavy, velvet curtain that threatened to fall on their reunion. Johnny slowly stood up, but he didn't return to his stage. Instead, he did something that would go down in history as the moment the king finally stepped down from his throne to serve a higher power. In that moment, the crown of the king of late night didn't just slip. It was cast aside by a man who realized that a throne is a very lonely place to sit when the person who taught you how to stand is crying in the third row. Johnny Carson stood up, But he didn't look back at the cameras. He looked at the wings of the stage, where the cold suits of the network, the executives who cared only for the bottom line, were frantically tapping their watches. They were pointing at the guest list for the evening, a list filled with movie stars who suddenly felt as thin as paper. But Johnny was no longer taking orders from the men in the high offices. With a sharp authority, Johnny gestured toward his famous desk and then to the chair reserved for the world's biggest celebrities. He told the crew to move the cameras, to forget the lighting cues, and to ignore the commercial break already 3 minutes overdue. The executives were fuming, their voices crackling in the headsets of the floor managers. But Johnny was a man in revolt. He reached out his hand to Mrs. Gable as a son, guiding a mother, helping her up the stairs and across the floor of the most famous set in the world. Ed McMahon sat in stunned silence, his booming laugh replaced by a soft, trembling smile as he watched Johnny pull out the guest chair for a retired teacher from the Midwest. The shift in the room was electric. Johnny sat behind his desk and leaned forward, focusing entirely on the woman beside him. He told the millions watching at home that the stars they had tuned in to see could wait until tomorrow because the person responsible for every moment of joy he had ever given them was finally sitting where she belonged. The panic in the control room was visible through the glass, as the network bosses realized they had lost control of their star. But Johnny simply looked at the lens and told them to keep rolling, or he would never sit in that chair again. It was a total surrender of ego, turning a multi-million-dollar production into a private conversation between two souls. Mrs. Gable sat there, her hands folded neatly over her beaded purse, looking at the city lights of the backdrop as if they were the stars over Nebraska. She seemed smaller in that oversized chair, but the dignity she radiated made the entire studio feel like a cathedral. The world watched as the man who had interviewed presidents became a humble listener to a woman who once taught him how to spell courage. As they sat there, charged with 50 years of gratitude, Mrs. Gable leaned in to share the secret that had kept her going through the quiet years of her approaching sunset. The silence in Studio One was absolute. Johnny leaned across that famous mahogany desk, his heart beating like a bird in a cage, while Mrs. Gable reached out to bridge the final inches between their worlds. In that moment, the lights of Hollywood faded, leaving two souls connected by a secret that had survived 50 winters. She leaned in and whispered 12 words that would forever alter the legend of Johnny Carson. "I kept every ribbon, John. I knew you would need them for the journey." Johnny sat back as if struck by lightning. For a long, agonizing minute, he couldn't even breathe. The audience watched as his skin turned pale, and he gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white, his composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. Those 12 words were the key to a door he had kept locked for decades, a reminder that through every moment of doubt, someone held the proof that he was enough. He realized Mrs. Gable hadn't just been a teacher. She was the guardian of his spirit. While he sought the approval of millions, she was in a small house, keeping scraps of blue silk in a cedar chest as a testament to the boy she loved. To the world, he was the king of late night, but to her, he was still the 12-year-old who needed a little magic to believe in himself. The weight of that devotion, preserved for 50 years, made his accolades look like children's toys. The cameras captured every second of his emotional undoing. There was no mockery, only the shared realization of pure, unscripted grace. Johnny took her frail hand in both of his, squeezing it as if to anchor himself to the earth. He looked at her through a veil of tears and said he had spent his life trying to earn those ribbons, never realizing the prize was won the moment she believed in him. Mrs. Gable smiled as she realized her mission was finally complete. The studio was a sea of weeping strangers, united by a man finding his soul on national television. But the night was far from over. Johnny was about to make a decision that would prove he was ready to put those ribbons to use. In the high-stakes world of broadcasting, Johnny did something that made executives turn pale. He looked directly into the camera, eyes shimmering with tears, and didn't ask for a commercial break. He told millions of people that the show they expected was over, because a more important story was beginning. The tension in the control room was thick, but Johnny didn't blink as he announced that for the first time in 22 years, The Tonight Show was going dark for a week. He was walking away from the lights of Burbank to fulfill a promise waiting in a cedar chest for half a century. He turned to Mrs. Gable and told her they were going home together. Producers whispered in his earpiece about contracts. But Johnny simply pulled the wire from his ear. He had spent his life being the man the world wanted. For the next 7 days, he would be the boy Mrs. Gable saved. The audience rose in a thunderous wave of appreciation. It was a standing ovation for a man who remembered his soul was more valuable than his career. Johnny gathered Mrs. Gable's purse and shawl, and as the band played a soft version of his theme song, he led her off the stage. He wasn't just giving her a ride, he was giving her a miracle. He had already instructed his pilot to prepare the jet for a flight to a small Nebraska airport, a place the glitz of Hollywood had long forgotten. As the screens across America faded to black, the news of his departure began to spread like wildfire. But Johnny was already gone. He had traded his tailored suit for a simple sweater and his limousine for a quiet plane ride into the heart of the country. For Mrs. Gable, whose health was like a flickering candle in a drafty room, this was the final surge of light she needed to make it through the night. She watched the lights of California disappear beneath the clouds, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the final sleep that was waiting for her. She was with her boy. This story is a reminder that we never truly know the impact we have on others. If you found this inspiring, please share this video with a friend who might need a reminder of their own worth today. The miracle wasn't just the trip or the money. It was the fact that the most famous man in the world was willing to be invisible just to make sure a lonely teacher felt seen. But as the plane touched down on the dark, quiet runway in the middle of a cornfield, a new chapter was about to be written. The roaring engines of the private jet finally went silent, replaced by the soft, rhythmic chirping of crickets and the scent of damp earth. Johnny stepped out onto the tarmac, drawing in a deep breath of the cold prairie air, feeling the layers of Hollywood artifice fall away until he was nothing more than a son of the plains returning to the soil that had raised him. He helped Mrs. Gable down the stairs as they made their way to a waiting car that would take them to her tiny, white-shingled house on the edge of town. For the next several days, the world wondered where the king of late night had vanished to. But inside that modest kitchen, the only thing that mattered was the whistle of the tea kettle and the sound of old stories being told. At one point, a local man delivering milk recognized the famous face through the window and stood frozen in disbelief. But Johnny just stepped outside, smiled, and asked to be called just John. Johnny didn't spend his time on the telephone. He spent it with his sleeves rolled up, washing the floral-patterned plates in her sink and listening to her talk about the neighbors he had forgotten. He sat at her small wooden table, the very same one where she had graded his papers 50 years ago, eating homemade peach cobbler and feeling a peace that all the money in California could never buy. He spent his afternoons reading aloud to her when her eyes grew tired, his famous voice filling the small rooms with the works of Mark Twain and Willa Cather. He wasn't performing for an audience of millions. He was performing for an audience of one, making sure every word was infused with the love and respect he had carried since he was 6 years old. Mrs. Gable would sit in her rocking chair, radiant with a joy that seemed to push back the shadows of her failing strength. She told him that these few days were like a beautiful sunset at the end of a very long, very blessed day, and she thanked him for coming back to the front row one last time. But even in the middle of this sanctuary, the reality of time was a guest that could not be ignored. Johnny noticed the way her breath was becoming shallower, and the way her hands trembled when she tried to hold her teacup, and he realized the miracle he was providing wasn't about preventing the inevitable, but about honoring it. He stayed by her side through the quiet hours of the night, holding her hand and promising her that he would never forget the blue ribbons or the woman who gave them. As the week drew to a close, a heavy stillness settled over the little white house, signaling that the time for stories was coming to an end. The shadows grew long across the Nebraska floorboards, stretching out like the fingers of time reaching for the bond between a teacher and her student. In the quiet hush of that final afternoon, the world outside the small white house seemed to hold its breath. Johnny sat on a low footstool at Mrs. Gable's feet, the man who had everything realizing he was about to witness the only thing that actually mattered. Mrs. Gable's breathing had become as soft as a summer breeze through a screen door, a spirit ready to begin its final journey. She reached out and touched Johnny's hair, her fingers as light as a butterfly's wing, and she whispered for him to bring her the small cedar chest from the top of her dresser. Johnny carried the box over with trembling hands, the scent of aged wood and lavender filling the room, and he placed it on her lap. With a slow motion, she opened the lid to reveal a lifetime of memories, but tucked away in the very corner, wrapped in a piece of yellowed tissue paper, was something she had saved for the very end. It was a single, pristine blue ribbon made of the finest silk she had been able to find during the height of the Great Depression, and on it she had embroidered a single word in gold thread, "Beloved." She told him that she had made this ribbon on the night he left Nebraska, intending to give it to him at the train station, but she had missed him by only a few minutes. She had kept it for over 5 decades, waiting for the moment when the little boy with the magic tricks would come back to claim the prize he had earned simply by being himself. Johnny took the ribbon, and as his fingers brushed the silk, he felt the weight of every lonely night he had spent in a dressing room. Every moment he had felt like a fraud, despite the applause of millions. This wasn't a reward for his ratings. It was a reward for the quiet courage of a shy boy who had never stopped trying to make his teacher proud. "Mrs." Gable leaned back into her pillows, a look of profound peace settling over her features, and she told him that she could go to her rest now, because she knew that her most important work had been completed. She had seen her boy one last time, and she had given him the only crown he would ever truly need. Later that evening, as the first star of the Nebraska sky began to twinkle, Mrs. Gable peacefully transitioned, her hand tucked safely inside Johnny's. There were no cameras to record the way he bowed his head and wept for the woman who had seen the man he would become before he even knew how to dream. He stood there in the silence of the room, the blue ribbon clutched to his chest, realizing that his life would never be the same again. But as he prepared to return to California, Johnny knew that the empty chair in the third row would never truly be empty again. The lights of The Tonight Show returned to their full brilliance on a Monday night in late October, but for the man standing behind the curtain, the glow of the stage would never again be as bright as the memory of a candle in a Nebraska window. The world had waited a week for the return of their king, wondering if the man who stepped back onto that stage would be the same one who had walked away in tears. When the music started and the announcer called his name, Johnny Carson stepped through the curtains, but he didn't head straight for the microphone. Instead, he stopped and looked at a single, empty seat in the third row. He didn't perform his usual monologue that night. Instead, he walked slowly to his desk, sat down, and placed a small, framed piece of blue silk on the polished wood. He told the audience that he had finally understood what his career was, for that it wasn't about fame, but about the people who see us when we are invisible. He spoke of Mrs. Gable not as a departed soul, but as a living legacy that would now be woven into the very fabric of his life. From that night forward, Johnny was a different man. He became a silent benefactor to the retired teachers of America, setting up a foundation that functioned in total secrecy. Years later, after Johnny himself had left this world, a letter was found in his personal desk drawer. It was a note he had written to himself the night of Mrs. Gable's passing, simply stating that he had finally graduated from the only school that mattered. Those who worked behind the scenes noticed the change in the way he looked at the crowd. He was no longer just searching for the biggest laugh. He was looking for the person who looked like they needed to be seen. He kept that blue ribbon with the gold thread inside his desk drawer, and every night before the show began, he would touch the silk and whisper a silent thank you to the cornfields of his youth. The world saw a comedian, but Mrs. Gable had seen a miracle, and Johnny spent the rest of his life trying to live up to the image she had of him. He realized that we are all just students in a vast classroom, and the greatest magic trick of all is making someone feel that they are loved exactly as they are. The legend of the third row became a whisper in Hollywood, a story of a superstar who found his heart in the one place he never thought to look. Even after Johnny retired and the studio went dark for the final time, that empty seat remained a symbol of the promise he had kept. It was a reminder that no matter how high we climb, we must always remember the hands that helped us reach for the first rung of the ladder. He had won the biggest prize in television, but he moved on, knowing that the only award that mattered was the one made of silk and hope. Because in the end, we aren't remembered for the jokes we told or the shows we hosted, but for the way we loved the people who knew us before the world did. If you have a teacher who changed your life, perhaps today is the day to tell them that you still have your blue ribbon too. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button to help us share this message of gratitude with more people. If you believe that every child needs a Mrs. Gable in their corner, Subscribe and join our community of storytellers as we continue to celebrate the unsung heroes of our lives.